Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Have a Life Teaching podcast. I'm really excited today to actually be joined by a guest who is a great addition considering some of the earlier guests that we had. So those of you who listen to the podcast might remember that we recently had Kevin Foote from K-12 on the show talking about how he left the classroom but is still having impact in education by designing learning environments for students. And also Kevin moderates his own podcast at K-12 and actually had my next guest on his show. And they were talking a little bit about what architects can do to be developing 21st century learning environments for our students. So I wanted to reach out to that guest as well and really follow up on some of the things that he and Kevin were talking about. So again, really excited to have Prakash Nair joining us. He is the CEO of Education Design International, an architectural firm that designs learning spaces for students globally. So again, thought he would be a great person to talk about, or talk to, I should say, particularly as we move into the 21st century. And we really now are seeing more of our schools vested in 21st century learning principles, really designing our learning environments to be student-centered. So Prakash, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, John. It's great to see you again.
Exactly. And for those listeners, Prakash and I have actually had the opportunity to talk at other times too. So it's like speaking with an old friend. So thank you for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
So the first question I have is, how did you get involved as an architect in designing learning environments specifically? And why do you think this is an important and an emerging area of architectural design?
Well, it's not emerging in the sense that architects have been designing schools for over 100 years. And my introduction to that was in New York City when I was actually the director of operations for the largest school construction program in the world in New York City. At that point, I was doing what most architects do, which is take their cues from the educators and from their own mental model of what a school is supposed to look like. And so I, along with hundreds of others working together, designed and built at least 100 new schools and renovated well over 600 schools, which reinforced an industrial model of teaching and learning that has been around for over 100 years. So in other words, several $1 billion later, we had done nothing to advance the cause of education itself, which is why I started my own practice. And over the last 23 some years, gone in a completely different direction where I've made architecture actually meaningful in the context of education and learning.
So speaking about that, Prakash, when we say making learning spaces or learning environments meaningful in an educational context, what does a student-centered learning environment mean to you? And how does your firm, EDI, support that?
Well, first, I have to say that the entire architectural model of school that we are all familiar with, I would say 95%+ of schools around there, are based on a model of education that is not student-centered. It was designed by adults, for adults, to graduate students who would be very good to work in a factory, right? In other words, we've never had an education system as well suited to the industrial age as we have today, because we perfected it over 100 years, right? So my point is that the architecture is just a physical manifestation of an outdated philosophy. And because the architecture is so profoundly important, because the architecture is what allows you to do certain things and militate you from doing other things. So in a sense, what we are saying is that the architecture has already determined the kind of education you can have there. And therefore, if you want to change education, you have to change architecture in the same way that if you want a more advanced software to run, you can't be using an Apple IIe from 1981, right?
Right.
And that might seem funny because that was only 40 years ago, whereas the school buildings as a technology is over 100 years ago old, and we're still stuck with it. If we were working on an Apple IIe today, we couldn't have this podcast. There are hundreds of things that we today take for granted we could not be doing. And it's the same thing. Education is being incredibly constrained by the hardware of school design, but most people don't realize to what extent architects and architecture is actually standing in the way.
That makes sense to me. In fact, I was doing work in a building today that probably was built in the teens or the 1920s. So I definitely understand what you're talking about. And I think that goes across rural school districts, suburban and urban, but it does seem that a lot of our older buildings are more in those rural or urban areas rather than the suburban areas. But I definitely understand what you're talking about in terms of trying to teach new methodologies with that old hardware. So speaking of that, Prakash, what do you then see as the new modalities, and how does your architecture support that?
Yeah, okay. So if you were to keep aside our mental model of what a school is supposed to look like, right? And a mental model of what a school looks like has to do with classrooms and teachers in the classrooms, which we can talk about, because you may ask me, well, what happens to those schools? And we can talk about that as well. But if you were to keep all of that aside, and if you were to start from scratch with the research that we know today about what learning is, how children learn, what are their fundamental human needs, which goes to things like autonomy, competence, relatedness, all of those kinds of things, even called a theory called self-determination theory that my colleague Parul has publicized in recent times. But all of that research from neuroscience and choice architecture and various other disciplines, if you were to truly follow that research and design a school today, even assuming a school in the traditional sense is even needed, because in the old days you needed a school to get the fundamentals right of learning, which of course you don't need to be in a physical school for that. But even assuming that you're not going to get rid of the school as an institution, you would not design yesterday's school. You wouldn't design a school with classrooms and corridors and a library and a cafeteria and a gymnasium where students are marched from cell to cell, and we call it cells and bells. When bell goes off, right? So we would start with the idea of different ways in which children learn, which could be independent study, it could be collaboration, it could be doing something, building something, music, performance, presentations, learning from nature, learning through music, and various other ways in which we learn. And we've identified at least 20 such modalities and designed the school as a variety of such spaces where students can naturally gravitate to the space that best suits what it is that they actually want to do, as opposed to the generic spaces that we now try to, it's like the classroom is the jack of all trades, master of none. I mean, you try to do a lot of things in there, but not very successfully, right? But if you design it from the ground up, we would design it in such a way that there's a tremendous variety of spaces for large groups, small groups, individual study, and on and on. And so the curriculum can become much richer. The pedagogy can become much richer. And this teacher-student ratio can be constantly variable throughout the school day, as opposed to the 1:20 or 1:25 that we have fixed in a traditional classroom.
Or what are some of the ways that you as an architect, can make a space variable? I mean, you mentioned, the old school buildings with those fixed walls. When you're designing a space where, let's say today you want to use it for a small pullout group, and tomorrow there's going to be an assembly, so more students are going to need to utilize the space. How do you design the interior of a new building to accommodate that variable use?
Yeah, so I would give you the analogy of a home. You don't come home every day and start rearranging furniture. Today, my wife's hosting 20 people, and so she had to move some furniture around. But that's not a daily occurrence, right?
Right.
And the reason for that is very simple, because our home has a variety of spaces. You occupy the space that suits what you're doing. If you're having dinner or whatever, you might be around the kitchen table. If it's a formal dinner, maybe at the dining room, or you might be in the living room watching stuff, or doing work, or in the family room, and everybody's together, and on and on. And if it's a nice day, maybe you are out on the patio, etc., right? And that's what a school should be. In other words, the school should be a place where children naturally gravitate to spaces and places that better suit the activities that they want to accomplish, as opposed to us trying to eat. I mean, yeah, people might want to eat dinner watching TV in their bedroom, but it's not necessarily the most, comfortable or safest place to do that, because you may, So my point is that you can do things in places that they're not designed for. But why? If you have the variety, then you will naturally go to those kinds of spaces. So our schools essentially get rid of the notion of a traditional classroom. Instead of that, we have something called a learning studio, where direct instruction is not eschewed. I mean, if a teacher wants to spend time with 20 students, giving them some instruction, by all means do it. But you're not going to be instructing them all day, because if you're instructing them all day, what are they doing? Right. Mm-hmm. So you instruct them, and then they go off and do their own thing. And they go off and do their own thing in the spaces best suited for what you ask them to do. If you ask them to collaborate, they may go to a space suited for that. If you ask them to do independent study or research, they may go to a quiet corner. If you ask them to commune with nature, they might be out, doing some science experiment outside, and on and on and on. So that variety trumps flexibility, which is what everybody touts. So we have a very flexible space, which means people are constantly moving furniture around, which it makes no sense at all,
So you talk about designing these spaces with purpose in mind, and having students go off and utilize the spaces in the building that are appropriate for what they are working on, and to help them develop their agency. Describe, unless you want to mention some specific schools that you've designed around the world, but can you talk about some of the specific communities or types of communities that you worked in, and how you have designed those spaces to reflect those communities' values?
Yeah, that's true. Good point. I mean, we've designed schools that are as big as 1 million square feet. In fact, our newest school just opened in China, the Beijing Navigation School, which I think is the largest school in the country, and probably the first one designed according to our principles of student-centered learning and learning communities. And so that's a big project where they wanted to do something, push the boundaries of innovation that way. But there are very small projects, like we have Anne Frank Inspire Academy in San Antonio, which is truly using the spaces in a way that allows them to truly implement an inquiry-based curriculum. So what I'm saying is that if the curriculum and the spaces are in sync, then the results are very, very different than you trying to force a student-centered inquiry-based curriculum in a traditional classroom setting. That's much, much more difficult. So we have many such examples all around the world of American School of Bombay, and more recently American Embassy School in New Delhi. These are more of the recent projects that we working on. There was even for early childhood, worked on a project in Argentina, Northlands School. Dozens of such projects where we feel like the architecture and the learning all kind of work together in harmony. And what was the second part of your question?
Well, no, I think you were answering it. I was intrigued to learn from you how your architecture has specifically mirrored the various values and of different school communities in which you've worked. So you were mentioning that one school has an inquiry-based learning model, and designed your space around that.
Right. And you're right about that, because the culture of a place is very important. We have been talking recently to a community in India where they have brought back to life a barren desert, and it's now a lush greenery, and they want most of the curriculum to be an outdoor curriculum. And so that is their culture. So we would not be designing a a kind of a monument. We want something like Frank Lloyd Wright's organic architecture, something that almost melts into the landscape. There's an inside-outside connection is so strong. So I'm saying that's an extreme example of what a culture might do to a school building, and there are schools, whether it's a Jewish school or a Catholic school or others, that have some traditions which we don't want to ignore. We want to celebrate those traditions, while at the same time bringing them into the modern world.
I love your analogy of Frank Lloyd Wright, because I have been to Taliesin West. And I love the place.
Exactly.
It's unique. It's unique
unique.
It definitely represents his personality from the way I understood
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
But definitely an interesting.
I'll be visiting in a couple of months. I've been there several times and hope to go back very soon. Yeah.
Yeah, I liked his, but this is because I'm a cinephile. I love movies. I loved that he had his own private movie theater. I mean, that has nothing to do with our talk, but just anyone that has their own movie theater is a friend of mine. I just find that wonderful. I wish I could have a movie theater in my 600 square foot apartment, but I don't think that's going to happen, Prakash.
Not in the short term, at least.
No, but to your point, thinking of Taliesin West and from, being there and seeing it, it really is a studio, to your comment before about designing studio spaces. And it's funny you mentioned studio, because our recent guest on an episode that's just been published, our guest was Mariah Rankin Landers, and she was really talking about making learning, not so much in the physical sense, but in the metaphorical sense, making learning a studio and bringing in the arts and bringing in culture. And again, having students express themselves in whatever they're learning by incorporating those arts. So again, turning the quote unquote classroom into a studio. So I see a trend emerging from my various guests. So thank you for mentioning that. I would say, as a follow-up question to what we're talking about, so you were talking about some of those designs that you've been working on in different countries. Now, in your opinion, given all the work that you're doing around the world, would you say that there are countries that are more advanced in their understanding of what student ownership of learning is, in your experience?
I think Finland probably would qualify in that regard. And to be honest, the thing that Finland does, which might surprise many people, is not to take school as seriously as we do, because they realize that the formal education that we give students is actually counterintuitive when you think in terms of how you want children to become autonomous. Because giving them all that structure when they should actually be figuring out how to navigate the world on their own. And in fact, the sad thing is that the structure gets more and more rigorous as you go up the grades, right? I mean, you start with kindergarten with a lot of freedom, and then by the time you get to high school, it's so super structured, right? And I think Finland has recognized that students need to be a big part of everything. They've also realized that subjects unto themselves don't make much sense. So more and more, I think maybe even at the national level, they're getting rid of the idea of subjects because of the understanding that everything in the world is tied to everything else. We live in a very interconnected world. So you don't encounter chemistry unto itself in the world, or social studies in it unto itself. It's in the context of so many other things that are happening. So I think that children should see that larger context. Mathematics is a perfect example of, there's even a write-up that I love called The Mathematician's Lament, where all the beauty has been sucked out of the way mathematics is taught in schools. It's actually a beautiful subject if children only understood how beautiful, how everything around us has a mathematical construct, So all of that kind of stuff, I think that Finland is definitely way ahead of many of the other countries. But individual schools in many parts of the world, whether it's Australia or, as I said, even India or various parts of Europe and the United States, are individually doing a lot of that stuff. But as a country, I think Finland is ahead of the curve.
And would you have an idea as to who is an emerging player in the space in terms of a country? maybe not where Finland is, but definitely has these goals of student ownership in mind.
I think Singapore has always strived to do that. But the interesting thing about Singapore is that it's a society which values community over individuals, which is a great thing in many ways, because when you do that, then everybody cares about everybody else. And in the process, everybody prospers. But the downside is that individuality isn't celebrated to the extent that we might say celebrated in the United States. So some of these concepts we're talking about are US concepts based on a Western cultural background. And so they might not play as well in some of the Asian countries where maybe they don't care as much for individuality, but care more about community, you know? So while Singapore has definitely taken note of what's happening in places like Finland, they are also to some extent held back, maybe in a good way, because of their cultural sort of tendencies.
What would you recommend for, say, teachers who are interested in developing learner-centered spaces or a learner-centered environment when they are in a building that was built in 1915, or when their community is not going to be redesigning the building to be representative of the outdoors? Some ways, because I don't want people listening to have envy and get frustrated and then say, oh, I hate teaching, I hate education, I'm leaving. This is the way it should be and it's not. What you're recommending is what we should be moving towards. But as to the things we were talking about before, some communities and some countries are further along in this journey than others. So what would you recommend for teachers in less than ideal environments, how they could make those environments more ideal for learner-centered work?
Yeah, I get where you're coming from. I think that it is very important not to lose sight of where we want to go, right? But it doesn't mean that we might get there tomorrow. And therefore, what happens in the meantime? And what happens to those teachers who truly care about their children, but are trapped in a classroom, right? And I think the point in those cases is obviously if there's outdoors, of any kind of outdoor space. Anna Harrison, who works with me, has been very vocal about teachers going outside and taking their children outside, because now you don't have the limitations of those four walls, and it expands. And by the way, there's also psychological reasons for doing that, because your view of the world expands as you're not trapped in a small box, right? But that's one thing. But I think that ultimately it's about a teacher understanding that teaching and learning are not the same thing. So what happens is that teachers, because of their great concern for students, tend to teach. And what my point is that all the research shows that most of what we do that we call teaching is called pseudo-teaching. And in fact, that it's a chapter in our latest book. It's called A New Language of School Design. And it's free, by the way, the electronic copy of that, and maybe you can send it out to your audience. So pseudo-teaching basically is a teacher's desire to teach and somehow get her students to learn. But the bottom line of it is that real learning only happens when the learner is engaged, interested, motivated, and wants to learn something. And in the process actually does something, maybe makes mistakes or whatever. So my point is that if a teacher were to change a lecture into a series of provocative prompts, which might take 5 minutes as opposed to 30 minutes, you're far more likely to get an exciting, engaging lesson than you would with a very structured thing where you go through the textbook and go subject by subject and start writing things on the whiteboard. So even more than the furniture, even more than the building, that pedagogy to me can be something you can do today, immediately.
In my coaching work, that's a big part of what I and my colleagues do, where it's, how do we, in less than a totally ideal environment, get students more engaged in what they're learning, and how did we help them to create knowledge that they create based on, what we're presenting them, that what we're presenting them is not the be all end all, but again, just the ground floor, and then hoping to get them interested in inquiry and exploring more and learning more. So thank you for saying
Right.
that.
Right.
Prakash, is there anything that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, I want to elaborate on what I just said earlier. I make it simple. I want to take my friend Dr. Gary Steger's has compressed what I just said to you in 5 minutes in 4 words, and that is less us, more them. So if a teacher walks into a classroom with those 4 words, she's going to remind herself, I should stop talking now, because every time I talk, it's that time that they're not doing anything. The minute I stop talking, there's a chance at least that they will do something. So less us, more them. So that would be a mantra that all teachers can take into their classrooms.
In fact, I've used that once or twice myself. So
Okay.
I totally believe in it. So again, what I was suggesting before, I love that you added less us, more them, because I think that is very simple and very clear in terms of how to create environments that are at least approaching more student ownership. Anything we talk that we didn't get to talk about, Prakash, either about design and architecture of learning environments, our goals in the design of our learning environments, anything at all that you really feel that our listeners should know that I didn't ask you?
Well, I think that many people are probably feeling this kind of despondent that they're trapped in these old buildings built 50, 60 years ago, even 20 or 30 years ago, that are designed and modeled along the lines of the industrial factory, right? And we've taken many of those kinds of buildings, and usually over summer breaks have been able to bring those back to life. And that's actually not so complicated and not so expensive at all. Because basically what you do is, if you have a building which is a column and beam structure, which I would say 70% of buildings have, then all the intermediate walls, including the hallway walls, are you can demolish them without in any way impacting the structure. And demolition is the cheapest part of construction. It's very cheap to do demolition. And then the resulting spaces that you have, you can reconfigure with inexpensive partitions or just furniture, to create the variety of spaces that I talked to you about. And that's what we call a learning community. A learning community is a space where teachers and students work as a community, where teachers get to work with their colleagues, which they definitely don't get to do when they're trapped in a classroom. So the same space, and you gain back the corridor space, you gain back the hallway space. So you can get about 20% more space than you had when you started the process. You get the teachers to work collaboratively. You get that variety of space that I talked to you about, and you get to keep the old building without spending a lot of money. So those are all the things that I would say, if you have the luxury of spending even small amounts of money. If you don't have that, then you can make it a student project. Hey, let's take our classroom. Let's do some research about the kinds of furniture and things that could make us better able to do all the things that we are excited to do, whether it's have a musical instrument there or whether it's be able to sit on the floor or whatever. Let's get rid of everything that's in here, and let's get donations from the community. Let's go become entrepreneurial here, and becomes an exercise in students for design, problem solving, community outreach. There's a lot of lessons built into that. So don't have to put all your hope in the system trying to fix things. You can take matters into your own hands. And many teachers who've done that have done it exceptionally well, very successfully. I've seen this happen all around the world.
Gosh, is there any particular community that you want to shout out that developed a learner community that bears mentioning?
Yeah, I go back to my favorite. In fact, it was on the cover of our last book, even the first language school design, and that's our friends at San Antonio, for whom we are designing a new school, by the way, in Sherman, Texas. And that's the Anne Frank Inspire Academy. And they really, stayed the course in terms of not losing sight of where they started, and continuing to build on that. So,
Prakash, you were mentioning that you have several books out. EDI, Education Design International, has these books.
right.
One was just recently published. So my last question for you is, how can people find out more about you and EDI?
Yeah, you can just go to educationdesign.com, and That's educationdesign.com. And if you go to our media page, it's a publications section where you can get access to all of these. And most of the stuff that we have, you can also find free electronic versions of it. Of course, all of this is also available on Amazon. We have several white papers and several books that have really pushed this. And by the way, a lot of the stuff I'm talking to you about might sound radical, but it's not. It's pretty mainstream. And most mainstream organizations have accepted it. And you may have seen my book, Blueprint for Tomorrow, which is actually published by Harvard Education Press, a pretty conservative state organization. They're not going to print something that's way out there in left field. But, because they understand that the world is changing and school buildings, along with everything else in education, they also have to change.
And what I'll do, Prakash, is I will link to your website, so people will be able to go there and directly see your publication. Prakash, thank you so much for being a guest on the show. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, John. And I look forward to hearing not only this, but all your other podcasts as well.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Okay. Take care.
Take
Bye-bye.
care. Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.